Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Today the journals of Arnold Bennett. Now Arnold Bennett was an English writer. He died in 1931. He was born in 1867. Arnold Bennett today might not be as famous as he once was, but in the England of the 1910, 1920, 1930, he was immensely famous. In fact, he became very, very wealthy as well as a writer. Now, why do we want to talk about his journals? They were kept over many, many years. In fact, from about the moment he published his first book in 1898, called A Man from the North, up until really just before his death. And Arnold Bennett was not only famous as himself, he was also famous for knowing pretty much everybody. In fact, everybody knew him as well. And that meant, obviously, all the literary circles, the writing circles, but also the journalistic circles. And so Arnold Bennett, even though he is indeed largely not quite forgotten perhaps, but left a little bit behind probably. Arnold Bennett lived and wrote and was well known for his novels and short stories and plays at the exact same time that literary giants like Virginia Woolf, T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound, James Joyce, all those people were, of course, creating a revolution in literature. And they were writing exactly at the same time as Arnold Bennett. Arnold Bennett sold many, many books, while Virginia Woolf, famously, of course, sold very few books while she was alive. Now, this is really a journal which is extremely interesting for all it tells us about the world, England, London especially at that time, the literary world, but also the world in general. Bennett is very observant. Bennett likes to learn things. Certainly in the very beginning, he's very determined to learn as many things as he can: Greek, Latin, Italian. He married a French woman. He was very much into French literature in general, poetry and novels. He wrote and he read in French, and he also worked on his French. And he was constantly looking for new things to grow into. But at the same time, Arnold Bennett was not one of those modernists like Virginia Woolf or T.S. Eliot, and he had a very different approach, as it were, to writing. So, in many ways, you could say that Arnold Bennett was the complete antithesis of Virginia Woolf, and in fact, there is a very famous essay by Virginia Woolf directly relating to Arnold Bennett. Now, this is very interesting for us because basically what it means here is that, as usual, the very successful, very popular, very famous, and ultimately very rich Arnold Bennett made his fame and his money by the same means as Virginia Woolf and James Joyce. But Virginia Woolf did not admire Arnold Bennett's style or way of doing literature, as it were, while in fact Arnold Bennett, it's very clear from his journals, admired her and her writing very much indeed. In fact, in his journals, it's very clear that at some stage he says of D.H. Lawrence, surely somebody very far remote from Bennett, he says of D.H. Lawrence that Lawrence is the greatest living English writer except for James Joyce. And now if you can find two more opposed types of writing as Arnold Bennett and James Joyce, then I'll be happy to see it in the comments. Thank you very much. So that's it. Basically, Arnold Bennett suffered from snobism. That is, people look down on him. Now, why is that? It's quite simply because Arnold Bennett came from the north of England. And the north of England is historically and culturally poorer than the south of England. The south of England has London, has the center of industry, has the center of finances. And certainly in the north, historically, those regions were pretty poor and rural. And then, of course, through the Industrial Revolution, became centers of making things or extracting coal, and of course all this affected, as it did everywhere else, the livelihood of people up there. So when Arnold Bennett comes down to London, we know that not only perhaps does he look a little bit less sophisticated than the others around him, but he certainly sounds different as well, because he comes down with a northern accent that many people, Somerset Maugham, for example, in his recollections, will remark on making fun of his face, red, his speech, his manner of speech, his pronunciation, etc., etc. And here is a great example of one of the aspects of the Bloomsbury set, for example, that is not always, kept into account, taken into account rather, and that is, of course, the extreme intellectual and class-based snobism of many of those within the Bloomsbury circles. But well, Lytton Strachey is a great example, I guess. Virginia Woolf is as well, of course. So that is very interesting in those journals, is that the position of Bennett, right from the beginning in the literary circles in London, is that it's not only that he has to make his way in those circles through his writings, he really has to make his way in those circles, which, socially speaking, is much more difficult than, in a way, artistically speaking. So what do we have here? We have basically somebody who presented himself as a sort of almost voice for the voiceless, or voice of the people, in his very famous Five Town novels. So as I said, The Man from the North is the first one in 1898. We've got Anna of the Five Towns in 1902, still in print, still a very well-known book. The Grand Babylon Hotel, 1902 as well. And the Grand Babylon Hotel is a caper, as he calls it, that is a kind of easy-to-read sort of mystery story. The Old Wives' Tales is probably his most famous book from 1908, with Clayhanger, 1910, and Runciman Steps, in fact, from 1923. Those are and remain books in print and still read and still referred to. Certainly, he talked about where he came from, the potteries, the so-called Five Towns of the potteries. And that, of course, at that time clashed completely with the sort of cultural tradition of literature being written by the well-to-do, the intellectuals, etc. Do not forget that all the men within the Bloomsbury circle, of course, went to Oxford or usually Cambridge. The women are very well educated. Virginia Woolf and her sister, Vanessa, came from a very, very old English family. So this is really a conjunction of two different worlds, and that what also transpires a little bit in those diaries. Now, basically, Arnold Bennett, what he shows us in those journals is that writing is a job. That's what it is. Writing may be artistically fulfilling, and he certainly is fulfilled. It might be artistically rewarding as well for others and for himself. He may have aspirations of literary greatness. He certainly writes a lot of poetry as well, and short stories. So he's not just producing pot boilers by the month to make money. But on the other hand, he's very clear that he has chosen this profession of writing as sole profession. He will not do anything else. And by that, the moment, of course, you've made the decision, then you have to bring money in. He will get married, he will need a house, he will need to eat, and all those things simply do not happen if you hole up in a room somewhere, in a basement, and try to write beautiful, tortured poetry. If you do so, you will have to find other means of feeding yourself, which is of course, things that happened in the Bohemian Paris, for example, at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century. But Arnold Bennett wants to live off his writing. So what do? Well, you need to write novels, because, of course, novels were very much in demand at the time. You also write plays, because plays were still, remember, this is before the cinema, plays were still a major way of making your name, really, and making money as well. He writes poetry, he writes short stories, he writes everything, and of course he has to have some sort of regular income, as it were, so he writes columns in some newspapers or magazines, sometimes under his own name and sometimes as well under a different name. And that reminds us straight off the bat that for him it's extremely important to have a regular rhythm. He cannot afford to just walk around thinking about the beauty of life every day. No, he's got to really buckle up and say, okay, now I'm working. That reminds us of Martin Amis, of course, the wonderful English writer who died recently, who in an interview, I think it's a Paris interview, but I'm not sure, in an interview described his process when writing one of his novels, Night Train. I think he was in Paris at the time, and he describes it as it was a 9 to 12, 1 to 5 job every day. No exception, no weekend. Every day from 9 to 12 at the writing table, from 1 to 5 at the writing table. Famously, of course, in the history of literature, Trollope, the English writer at the end of the 19th century, who worked at the post office in his regular day, as it were. So every day he woke up extremely early and wrote for an hour or two before going off to work. And that reminds us, and that's what Bennett reminds us so forcefully, is that the romantic picture or the hyper-intellectualized picture of the writer, hair in the wind, waiting for inspiration to strike, and then suddenly feverishly scribbling down a few things, and then going off for a walk or going off for a pint. This is not, of course, at all what happens when you write books for a living. Now or then, you simply have to be at your table and write, or in your sofa, or however you decide to write, or writing standing up like Dr. Johnson. You have to go and do it, man. That's what the deal is, really. And that's exactly what Bennett does. So Bennett tells us how many times, how many hours per day he spends at his desk, how many words per day he writes. I begin work on my novel at 9:30 and I work till 12:30. Then my afternoons are often taken up with articles. That's around 2,000 words a day at least. But in fact, many days it's 3,000, 4,000 words a day. And he keeps to the schedule. And that is, he is not slackening off by saying, oh yeah, I did 1,000 words yesterday, so I'm good. No. Every day, 9:30, he's up and about and simply writes. This is an attitude that Margaret Atwood, also the great Canadian writer, I described somewhere. I think she writes up to 5 to 7 drafts before she accepts that the novel has to be completed. And that is, you write a draft of 500 pages, then you reread and you correct, and you reread and you correct, and you read, etc., etc. And this endless process of writing, reading oneself, rewriting, is exactly what Arnold Bennett describes in his fantastic journal. So he also tells us a lot about how writers approach their task, their craft. And again, it clashes, of course, with that so-called romantic image that we, have been sold many times over. That is, you wait to be struck again by the muse or the inspiration, and then off you go, you write something. This is, of course, you already know that. If you know Vladimir Nabokov, for example, he's very famous for having kept index cards with everything plotted out, characters, situations, scenes, places, everything, well in advance of writing the book. He didn't simply wait to be struck by inspiration. That's exactly what Arnold Bennett describes also in his journals. What he's struck by might be an idea. Oh, I would like to write this type of novel. And then what he does really is that he starts plotting the novel in advance so that he knows exactly what is going to happen, when, etc. For example, he says, on Saturday morning, I walked in the forest for 2 hours and completely finished the plan of my new play. In his head, obviously, he wasn't writing it down. In other words, he thinks about the plan of the play, the arc of the play, how things are going to add up, as it were, and that's where he works towards. Another one, he says again, this morning I walked for 2 hours in the park in search of my play, and I found a fairly complete scheme for the whole of it. So that's what he describes again and again. He says, okay, this book, for example, is going to be around 60 to 70,000 words. He already knows the length, more or less. And then he says, I envisage about 20 chapters. So already subdivisions are identified. And then basically he works down from there. He estimates a little bit how much time it will take him to write so many words per day, as it were, for so many chapters. And that's how he goes. And then he says, somewhere, many times in his journal, today I started on my new novel, I wrote 900 words, etc., etc. And all those things are coming through very, very clearly and reminding us what it is to actually write for a living. It is not, again, doing anything you fancy and suddenly, being absorbed by it from an hour or two. No, it is really plotting, planning, knowing exactly what you want to do, how the thing is going to progress, where it's going to end, and then remains the job of writing it, of course. It's also important here to say that Arnold Bennett did his research for the books that he wrote. So again, it is not simply somebody writing and thinking to myself, okay, now I need a scene between two characters, or now I need my character to go from A to B. It is also somebody who's thinking very much about the content of the book and the exactitude that he may need to make a scene realistic, even if he realizes very well that is not probably going to be seen, in fact, by many readers of the book. And he says here, I have a quote for you. Yesterday I finished making a list of all social, political and artistic events which I thought possibly useful for my novel between 1872 and 1882. Tedious bore for a trifling ultimate result, but necessary. In other words, he knows that he's spending hours doing something that nobody will notice, that nobody really needs in a novel, but for him, in the construction of the novel, this is just as important as anything else. So Arnold Bennett gives us the portrait, or the auto-portrait, of somebody who wants to make money. Not because he is greedy in that sense, but quite simply because he needs to live, and he wants to live well, and he wants to have pleasure in the things that he has. In fact, he will end up famously buying a yacht because he loved boating and yachting. And that's what he wanted. And he thought, okay, well, how can I do that? Well, his novels sell, and his novels sold very well. They were very famous at the time. But he also wrote a lot of, let's say, secondary material, which he is very clear about in the journals. Sometimes he says, I finished this book, I don't think it's very good, it's well put together, but nothing very interesting in it. But yeah, he has to produce, he's under contract also to write books, but also he needs to produce, and when one book does well, it might, of course, spur him on to bring out another to hope to capitalize on the success of the first. Yeah, the rights to some of his books are suddenly bought by an American publisher, and is over the moon because he sees, okay, now I'm going to make at least about £600 a year guaranteed on those 3 books. So then he starts thinking about how can I make more and more, etc. If you have ever read or looked at the famous Pepys diary between 1660 and 1669, Pepys, certainly in the first few years of his diary, always ends the year with a sort of budget overview, how much money he has spent, how much money he has made, how much money he has managed to save. And that gives him really a sense of completion of the year and of seeing that year on year he is saving more, earning more, and becoming, as it were, more bourgeois, you could say, in the case of Pepys. And that's exactly what Arnold Bennett does. He looks at how many words he's written, but also how much money he's made, how many books he's sold, because for him it is a job. Writing is work. You don't do it on the hoof. You don't do it as a distraction. You do it 100%. And you plan, you work for it. You put in the time, you put in the many hours necessary to not only think but write the book, and ultimately you try and write as much as you can in all possible genres, including entertainment, including, let's say, pot boilers, including second or third rate novels at time, and certainly including popularizing texts, some of which are actually very, very good, I thought. Written right at the beginning of the 20th century. Some very interesting books to introduce literature, for example, to everyone. And all of that writing goes into production to eventually enable you to make a living, to enable you to now and again write something that you know might not sell, but rewards you on a different level. And in the end, you do that because writing is a job. Writing is not something you do like that. Writing is simply work. The journals of Arnold Bennett are wonderful for that. They're very nice to read. He wrote extremely fluently. And even if you don't really know him or have not read his novels, I can only recommend those journals. They still, today, remain a great moment in journal writing. Thank you.